Hello and welcome to Aurelian University. In this video, I'm just going to talk a little bit about Latin verbs, the different categories that we discuss when we talk about them. And there's one more thing I want you to know with pronunciation, and it has to do with the stress of a word, but I actually want to cover that when we do our first verbs, because our first actual verbs, because that'll make it a little bit easier. So in this video, we're just going to talk about what these terms mean and how they apply to verbs. So verbs, you'll often hear people say, are action words. A little bit more technically correct, it would be predicate words. In other words, they're words that make a statement about the subject. So person is a category. Person, number, tense, mood, aspect, and voice are 6 categories that we need to keep in mind when we're talking about verbs. Person means the degree to which the speaker is involved or the listener is involved in the verb. So if the subject of the verb is I or we, it's first person because that includes the speaker. So if I were to say, I run, run would be a first person verb because its subject includes the speaker. If it includes the listener, it's a second person verb. So you, if you are running, that's a second, run would be a second person verb in that case, if I say you run. And third person verbs include neither. So he, she, it, or they in English, and those would all be third person verbs. Number means singular or plural, and so it just means whether the subject includes one or multiple people. So for example, on our example up here, I run, run is a singular verb because the subject is singular. If I were to say we run, still first person, but it's changed to plural. Tense, in a really technical way, tense is either past, present, or future. It just refers to time. There are other times we could talk about, but in Latin, there's really just past, present, and future. Then I'm going to jump ahead to aspect here, because what we refer to generally in Latin when we're teaching people Latin as tense actually is a combination of tense and aspect. And so aspect is how an action occurs in a verb. So for example, we might have if we use the verb run again, if you say I run, that's present, right? But if you say I have run, have is technically a present tense verb, but it's got a perfective aspect. So it has, in the present tense, it is an accomplished act, which means it technically happened in the past tense, but we're referring to its perfective or accomplished state. So no need to worry about this too much. When we talk about tense, we'll usually combine tense and aspect, but linguistically, just understand they're a little bit different. And when we talk about them with Latin verbs, I'll go through and give an in-depth explanation of each tense, what we call a tense, even though linguistically that's a little inaccurate. Mood, there's several moods in Latin verbs. We're going to talk about, just to illustrate what a mood is, we're going to talk about just indicative and imperative. It's also subjunctive, for example. Mood just means essentially the intended understanding of the utterance or of the verb. So if I were to say, you run, I'm just sort of stating a fact so that everybody knows. If I were to say run, the subject of that is still you, but I'm telling you to do that, which means it's an imperative. So it's a sort of command. Subjunctive has other uses, but just understand that it's sort of the intended, or it deals with what is intended to be expressed by the predicate. In other words, whether it's a fact or a command, or in subjunctive, it could be a hypothetical, for example. And then the last one we want to talk about here is voice. In Latin, there's an active and passive voice. Some languages have other categories for voice, but we're not going to deal with those right now. So with active and passive, these are really easy to understand. If I were to say, what's a good example? I love Latin. That's an active verb, love. The passive form would be describing the object of the active form as the subject. So instead of Latin being the direct object, we'll make it the subject. So Latin, and we'll say the exact same thing, is loved by me, you could say. That's passive. So when the object of a normal verb becomes a subject, that's a passive verb. In English, we have sort of a roundabout way to do it with the word is. In Latin, there will be different verb forms for it. And so the reason we go through all of these is because Latin tends to, instead of having roundabout ways to say things like we do in English, they tend to have an ending on the verb that expresses all of these: person, number, tense, mood, aspect, and voice, all in the same verb. And so it's really important that you get that now, because verb forms will be radically different from each other in Latin, and they'll be they'll have much more variation than we have in English in terms of verb forms. So if you understand basically what these are, no need to write a dissertation on them or anything, just have a basic understanding of them, then you'll be able to understand Latin verbs really well.